Welcome back to Go-Tanium Tech Talks. I'm your host, Ashley McGlone. Today's episode is part one of a two-part series on Tanium Client Management. There are some tricks here that I think a lot of our admins just may not be aware of. So today we're going to talk about deploying the Tanium client to Windows, Mac, and Linux using Tanium. This is a feature request that's been around for years, and we actually started doing this quite a while ago. I just want to make sure everybody knows how to do it. It's really friendly, the way the Tanium interface works. And so our expert today is one of my buddies, Nate. Nate, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, Ashley. Yeah, my name is Nate O'Brien. I've been with the company for just about 4 years now. I am the Tanium Client Management SME lead, and I'm here today to talk about TCM.
So what you may not know is that Nate and I were in the same new hire class back in 2017, and I'm glad to have him on the show today. And hey, Nate, I noticed on the bookshelf behind you, we both have a large bookshelf back there. What's on your bookshelf? I noticed those little books right behind your head there. There's one with a moon on it, different things.
Yeah, so I grew up reading a lot of classics and reading a lot in general, thanks to my mother. And I've got, when I finally could afford it, I got myself a nice leather-bound collection of all the different books. That moon one is the Arabian Nights, for the record.
Oh, just a little light reading there between
It's been a while.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
All right. So, Nate, tell us the story about Tanium Client Management.
Or like you said, that was a feature request that existed for a very long time. We wanted the ability within the platform to be able to deploy the Tanium client out to the endpoints. We had client deployment tool for quite a while, which was very successful in its own right. But now we've essentially baked that functionality into the platform with Tanium Client Management. And we're baking in a number of other things as well, like client health. All of this wrapped around the ability to handle a collection of Tanium client configurations and credentials.
So, Nate, why don't you go ahead and take us into the console and give us an idea of what it takes to get started to set up this client deployment for Tanium?
Sure thing. So this is the Tanium Client Management homepage, and you'll notice right away that I've got three nice dashboards here, including zero health failure. So that's what it looks like when you have a clean environment, which I'm really proud of. And you'll notice that it gives you a breakdown of all the different client versions in your environment, as well as the different OS platforms. Now, because this is a test environment, you'll notice that it's a very pretty rainbow wheel of different OS operating systems. Now, once you're into Tanium Client Management, first thing you want to do is you want to start to configure a client configuration. You'll notice I have a couple here already, but I'm going to create a new one, and we're just going to call this Windows 745. I do need to define who that Tanium client is going to talk to in terms of a Tanium server. And we can add in my Tanium server there.
All right, now just for our audience sake here, I've never heard of Windows 745.
Windows Tanium client 745.
There we go.
Yep, absolutely fair point. And so you'll notice that I have selected the latest 7.4. I also have the option to select the latest 7.2, and that will always default to the latest 7.4 or 7.2 client. I can also manually specify that down here as necessary. So very fair point. Thanks, Ashley. I'm so used to doing that in shorthand for my lab environments that that's just where I went to. Now I can also decide which client platforms I'm going to support as part of this client configuration. And that can be important because maybe I only want to deploy to Windows for a deployment. Maybe I only want to deploy to Linux or Mac or so on and so forth. In this case, because of my name here, I'm going to go ahead and remove these platforms.
Now, when you click the client version there was a whole list of versions. Do I have to stage those somewhere? I know the answer to this, but I want to ask for our audience. Do I have to stage those and make those happen somewhere?
Now, if you're not air-gapped, absolutely not. We'll just reach out to our content.tanium.com and pull down any client binaries that we need to, including the correct versions of those client binaries. If you're air-gapped, we do have an ability to stage those files on your TMS Tanium module server. It's a very quick process, very easy to do. All you have to do is reach out to support or your local TAM.
And for those of you who have not maybe heard the term air gap before, so those are customers who have an isolated environment where they don't have a public internet connection to make those regular downloads of content from Tanium. So even in those cases, we still have abilities to do that. All right, let's keep going.
Absolutely. Now you'll notice that I've got a couple more fields here, right? I have the ability to define where I'm going to install Windows, the Windows Tanium client. And if I were to have other platforms here, there would be additional fields for those different platforms. I can define in the log level. One is generally a pretty acceptable way to deploy a Tanium client out. I can change the server port if necessary. I can change the amount of free disk space required for the Tanium client. By default, we limit or we restrict to endpoints that have at least 3 GB of free space left. I can then add custom client settings. This is important if you're maybe deploying to a VDI infrastructure, a virtual desktop infrastructure. It can also help you with some more specialized areas that might be in remote regions with slower connections. And last but not least, I can add custom tags here. So Nate's 745 Windows.
And that so custom tags are really important too, right? Because if you're deploying to a certain business unit, maybe you want to tag those machines if they don't have a standardized naming convention. I know I've used this a lot with my customers, not this particular deployment method here, but using the custom tagging to define those computer groups is really helpful, especially at the time of install. It really is helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is a key way to make sure that your infrastructure is divvied up properly to give you the ability to pull statistics on where Tanium clients are. Let's say if your logistical networks are not quite mapped up to your departments or your geographic regions by IP address, custom tags can be a real lifesaver.
Now, I noticed in there we didn't define the Tanium server IP address or server name. Actually, I'm sorry. I completely blew over it.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so in this case, you're probably used to seeing a more comprehensive list, and I could potentially also do Tanium server, which in this case, my Tanium server is just named Tanium server or Tanium server.local for the FQDN. If I had an HA Tanium server environment, I could also then proceed to add in the additional Tanium server IP addresses, host names, and FQDNs.
And zone servers as well, right? So I know servers. In my lab, I've got a couple zone servers, a couple Tanium servers. And when I was testing this, I wanted to see one client connect to zone server one client connect to zone server two, and Tanium server one, Tanium server two in my own home lab. And so I created a deployment with an IP for each one of those. So you can mix and match to whatever meets your requirements. So you think about what OS, what install packages you've got, what names of the servers, IPs are going in there, and that's really going to determine kind of how many different configurations you build out.
Absolutely. And so you make an important note on the zone servers issue. When I used to have customer accounts, we would have several accounts or several locations that were serviced by a specific zone server. Now, it can be very difficult for the Tanium module server to reach out across the internet to a zone server, say in Ireland or wherever it might be, because realistically, you don't want those connections on SSH, which is the Linux management protocol, or Windows WMI or Samba across the internet to those endpoints. So there may be concerns with that. Now, in the future, we do have some really exciting functionality coming down the road that's going to allow us to do remote deployments, but I can't speak too much to that just yet, but it is coming down the road.
That's a good distinction, because what we're talking about here is deploying the Tanium client. And I don't want to steal your thunder, but maybe you could explain to our audience where those deployments actually come from and the implications that has on networking.
Absolutely. So this is one of the key things that customers will run into with TCM. When we're deploying the Tanium client from the Tanium platform via Tanium Client Management, see how many times I can say Tanium in that sentence, it's actually coming from the Tanium module server. That's our base of operations for where all those executions of connections are coming from. So you have to have essentially networked line of sight to the endpoints you're trying to deploy to from the Tanium module server to those endpoints. Now, when you're deploying to Linux, like I mentioned, it's going to go over SSH, which requires port 22. When you're deploying to Windows, it's going to require connectivity on WMI and Samba, which are ports 135 and 445, respectively.
Sounds like you've said that a time or two.
I've written a lot of documentation on it. I've said it a lot of times, yes, sir.
Yeah. So there are some requirements you really want to. Speaking of docs, we've got a link for you here in the show notes to go check out the docs for Tanium Client Management. There are some pretty gnarly requirements to make this work, right? There's lots of ways you can deploy the Tanium client in your environment. And sometimes customers simply don't have any other tools in their environment, and they've used the Discover or something else to identify where those machines are. And we're going to, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're going to get into actually deploying here in a second, but just make sure you read through those prereqs. So next up, I've got a configuration. I'm guessing I'm going to have some way to authenticate to these machines. I can't just, Tanium is magic in a lot of ways, but we can't just magically guess a username and password on a machine. Take us to the next step here, Nate.
Absolutely. So you've got your client configuration. We're going to go into credentials here. And you know what? I just realized I didn't save the Windows 745. So in the future, we're just going to use global, and that's okay. I just want you to know what I'll be using going forward. And so I'm going to create a credential. Now, credentials, plural, to be specific, can have multiple sets of credentials within it. And so I can call this a global demo. And in this particular case, I'm going to deploy, because I don't have many domain joined machines, I'm just going to deploy using the local administrator account. Type in the password. I also have a secondary account in case that administrator account doesn't work for some reason. And now in a typical enterprise environment, you're most likely going to use a service account, right? So you're going to use the domain Tanium/Tanium, which is a horrible example. Nate's domain /Tanium, Tanium being the user, Nate's domain being the domain. Now that is the way we want to put these credentials into this particular field. Unfortunately, due to the restraints of the remote connections, we cannot do tanium@natesdomain.com. That will not work because of the @ sign. So remember, domain /user.
Yeah, and just to point out here, I know it's a common misconception that some people have thought over the years of deploying Tanium that Tanium needs a local account on all the endpoints in the admin group. And that is completely not the case. Tanium runs as local system on your endpoint. This deployment method is before Tanium is there. So you'll just need, a lot of shops have some type of Windows credential that's already got admin rights, and you want to manage that credential appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a important note. We do find that many of our customers will use a rotating credential to do these type of remote deployments. We will also find that there are a lot of customers who just have a dedicated remote service account whose password changes on a rotation or however so often that they can use for these type of remote deployments.
So going back into the interface, then we've got these batches of credentials. And so I could have a batch of credentials for, you know, my Windows servers, my Windows workstations, my lab environment versus, you know, different business units, whatever its management surface is. So tell us now, how do we do this with Mac and Linux? Coming from a Windows world, a lot of our admins might think that's a little trickier. What do we need to know there?
Yeah, it's pretty much identical to the Windows process. We can add in the usernames and the passwords. In addition to that, there are a lot of Linux admins who will be familiar with the idea of using a key to authenticate into a Linux machine, which we fully support. Copy and paste, if there is a key phrase, you can add that in as well. Which won't show if I don't have the actual key there. And that allows you to do those type of remote authentications using a key as well. In this case, my lab is not configured for that, so we'll keep that off.
And clearly a best practice would be to use a key if you're on a non-Windows OS there. And remembering that SSH is the requirement there. So that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so we can go ahead and save that. And we are ready to start the deployment at this point.
Fantastic. So what does that process look like then?
Absolutely. So we jump over to deployments, and you'll notice that I have a couple other deployments already set up here. I did a fairly large test the other day with Global 745. Notice my naming convention, it's pretty uniform. But right off the top, you're going to notice a couple things on this page. First off, the completed installations. Anywhere where you see green numbers is a really good thing on this. If you have failed installations, you're going to see red numbers right here. No connections will be a simple black. And that's just because, we expect that there are a certain number of IP addresses in your environment that will not respond to these attempts to deploy the client. Going back to what Ashley had mentioned about some of the more gnarly requirements of TCM, there are a list of things that can impact the ability to successfully deploy via TCM to our endpoints. And that is essentially all the common things that would prevent remote code execution. Firewalls blocking those ports we talked about, 22, 135, and 445, as well as services not being engaged if SSH service wasn't on, if WMI were disabled, so on and so forth. One of the more common things that I've been seeing in customers' environments is that IDSs and IPSs, those are intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems, will actually see the traffic and see that I have WMI traffic or RPC traffic, which is very similar to WMI traffic, Samba traffic, so on, and so forth, and will actually block those connections after the connection has already been made. This can be really confusing to TCM from the perspective of a piece of software deploying a piece of software, because all of a sudden our connection is terminated. We do have a lot of really great content that has been published, both on the doc site and available to TAMs and support TAMs for troubleshooting these issues. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you run into any issues where you're thinking, I should really be able to deploy to that endpoint. Most likely there's some environmental kind of impactor going on there.
Yeah, that's a good point to make there, Nate, that it is kind of tricky. And we realize that, think about it. This is a machine that's unmanaged. How do you just force your way through the front door to lay down an agent on that box? So there are some very specific requirements there around opening some things that you probably aren't accustomed to opening. So again, this may or may not be the ideal way for you to deploy the Tanium client. You want to make sure you review all those requirements in the docs site. So let's go ahead and create a deployment, Nate, and see what that process looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we click the create button here. We're going to give the deployment a name. And that's one of the more critical things, in my opinion, is you want to be able to have something fairly descriptive here, right? So in my case, I'm going to do a global demo to Windows Server 2019 and RHEL 8. It's pretty descriptive. This helps your fellow administrators know exactly what you've been publishing to. It helps you know later on when you come back to the deployment, hey, what did I do on Monday? And that's one of the more important things I like to mention. You can add a description in here as well. So, the date is pretty much unnecessary because we're going to describe that. In this case, I'm going to leave that blank. But do feel free to add more descriptors to the deployment. We're going to move on to selecting the client configuration. Now, I had that global configuration that I had created previously. We're going to select that. The credentials list, I'm going to use my global demo credentials list in this particular case. And targeting is really important here. So I can select a list of single IPs. You'll notice that it says comma delimited list of IPs as well. And we give an example of that in the field. I can use host names. Again, notice that this can be comma separated. A lot of folks really find that beneficial to be able to pipe in a list of computer names or IP addresses. I can do an IP range. So rather than doing a full CIDR range, I can just select to do a certain number of IPs based sequentially. Again, I've got the CIDR range. All of these fields are comma delimited. You'll notice that there's no example in this particular one, but I can do multiple CIDRs. Here's one thing that I will mention briefly on this topic. Be careful with deploying to too many IP addresses all in one go. I typically limit my larger tests to a /21 or smaller. That's about 4,000 IP addresses, if I recall correctly. It can take quite a while to go through these steps. Think about it, especially if you're doing both Linux and Windows. You're trying a connection on SSH. You're trying a connection on WMI and Samba. And so you've got multiple connection attempts to single IP addresses here. In the case of my credentials list, I've got 4 separate credentials. So now we're multiplying those things out by the number of credentials we have. And so when you're deploying to a larger set of IP addresses, it can take quite a while. And we'll talk about how to improve that speed later on. Last but not least, you can use Discover labels. I do not currently have Discover in this environment, so I don't see them here. But that's another great way to make sure that your targeting criteria is significantly more accurate. It gets rid of a lot of that white space IP address concern that you might have where you're targeting a number of IPs without actual endpoints on them. So Discover Label is a great way to go. In this particular case, I'm going to enter 2 IP addresses here that I had staged up for this demo. One is a Windows Server 2019 box, like I mentioned, and one is a RHEL 8 box, and that should do us. I can add additional targets here. This is another thing that often goes overlooked. So if I have, say, in addition to those 2 single IP addresses, I can add a CIDR range as well, and I can continue doing that. I'm going to delete those for now. Now, on the note of speeding things up, one thing I like to do is I like to reduce that retry delay to 1 second. Typically, you might want to be a little careful with this. Your NOC or your SOC might get a little bit nervous in this network operations center. And
yeah, that would never cause any problems in production.
No. On that note, really quick, keep in mind that it's always nice to give your SOC and NOC teams a little heads up. Hey guys, I'm doing some remote deployments over here. Depending on how tied in to things they are, it's good to give them a little heads up that you're doing these activities.
Yeah, word to the wise.
Yes, sir. So in my case, I like to reduce that retry delay. 5 seconds is a pretty conservative value here, so feel free to keep that to the default. I can set a retry limit. Where is this important? Consider account lockouts, right? If we have more than 5 credentials, we may want to be a little bit careful, or more credentials for, say, just Windows, or more credentials for just Linux, then our account lockout policy would allow us to reasonably try. This is something where we're probably going to want to consider breaking the deployment up and the credentials into 2 different sets so that we're not causing any account lockouts for people. That would be a really bad time. Now, the real trick here to speed things up is just to increase that installation limit. I typically set it to about 20. This is a very safe value. Why wouldn't you want to go very much further than that? Well, your TMS only has so many connections. Your Tanium module server only has so many connections that it can handle at any given time. Now, it's an order of magnitude greater than 20, but keep in mind that it's still doing a lot of other jobs. So I like to err on the side of safety and put a 20 in here, and that will speed up your deployments by about a factor of 4. Or not a factor, but by 4 times.
All right.
All right, continuing on, we can edit the SSH port. So if you're using a non-standard SSH port, that's a good place to check. File transfer timeouts. I've had a couple of customers who've had very, very slow WAN links. It's all addressable, so their TMS can reach out to it, but they've always wanted to be conscientious that file transfer timeouts may occur, and so you can edit that. Now, 10 minutes per file. Hopefully, we don't have to edit that. That would be a pretty slow connection, but maybe you're using some satellite stuff and it is a little slow. In that case, you would want to visit this particular setting. And then we are going to try on 7.4 clients, not 7.2, but on 7.4 clients, we will attempt to validate that the client has installed correctly and is healthy by checking the client API, which will only initialize after the client has installed and connected to the Tanium server. That's essentially what we're doing here. And it can take a couple of minutes for that to proceed. So we try up to 5 times to check that. Typically, I wouldn't recommend changing that value. Any questions so far, Ashley?
This is fantastic. We're running a little short on time, so let's go ahead and get through the end of the deployment because I want to see the results. There's some really cool things that are coming later.
Absolutely. All right. So last but not least, installation options. This is a source of some confusion for some folks. You'll notice that we have a series of radial buttons here and a checkbox. If we want to make sure that we're doing new installations, enable that checkbox. New installations are any endpoint that has never seen the Tanium client. Endpoints with existing Tanium clients is an additional check to endpoints without the Tanium client. And so what happens if we find an endpoint with the Tanium client? By default, we ignore it. We're not going to try and redeploy. We could try and upgrade it. That will include a check of the currently installed version of the Tanium client. If that Tanium client that is installed on the endpoint is lower in version number than the target version that we're using as part of the global configuration or the client configuration, we will upgrade it. Lastly, we can do a reinstall. Now, if that Tanium client is not currently functional, this by itself will attempt to just reinstall the Tanium client with the configuration mentioned. and try and get it communicating again. In all reality, most likely you're going to want to do a wipe data as if it's a new installation. What that's going to do is it's going to attempt to uninstall the current Tanium client, remove the directory, so it's a completely fresh start, and then reinstall or reinstall the client onto that endpoint. And lastly, we can choose to not do that if the Tanium client is currently connected to a server. This is a great thing to have not set if you're worried about running into another Tanium infrastructure's client that may be reporting back to itself and you don't want to overwrite that. If you do want to overwrite it, like going from a POC to an actual production lab or moving a client from a dev lab into your production environment, this is the box you would set to allow that. So once I have that, I'm going to go and deploy this right now, save and deploy. That's going to bring me right over to the deployment status window, and you'll notice a couple of things on this particular page. One is that we have a global status. This is the status of the deployment. Right now, it's preparing to run. It's going to go out and make sure that it has those latest 7.4 binaries because that's what we selected. And you'll see the details right here of it doing that. Once it's confirmed that it has the correct binaries, it's going to go ahead into deploying to targets. And so scroll down, we've got endpoint details, and here we see that it's already attempting the connection. You get a really nice status details update. This is all updating in real time, and so you're able to keep track of your deployment. We have a number of different statuses up here in the bar. These will both be under running. Anything that fails would be under failed. This will typically be because of antivirus. If something's popping up in antivirus, in failed, it's because an antivirus is killing the install process as we're going. Otherwise, it's going to go to no connection. So that is an important distinction that I like to make. And this is just doing its thing. It's continuing to go along. You'll notice that 196, I believe that's my rel box, is actually still attempting to connect. And so that just means it's iterating through the different, actually, I'm sorry, the 92 is definitely my rel box because I see SSH right there. And so this is my Windows box. It's attempting to go through those different credentials, and eventually we'll see that that connects successfully.
Well, it looks like you guys have thought of everything in this, Nate. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was just really impressed that there's this real-time feedback. And actually, if you expand one of those, you can actually watch the log. But let's look at a completed one. We'll do the old cooking show thing where we go look at one that's done, maybe. So let's go take a look at one that's finished and see what the end result looks like.
So we'll go back to that previous deployment I had done, the Global 745. This is basically an identical deployment. You'll notice that I jump right over to the complete tab here so I can see anything that's depleted successfully. I'm going to just jump into any one of these guys. Now, it takes a little bit of a practiced eye to start to make sense of these logs. The reason why they're here is not primarily for our users to go through and review these every time. It's more for if there's a problem deploying. While we do a pretty good job of telling you exactly why we suspect that deployment failed, a lot of times you're going to have to bring this over to your support team or your TAM to help review. And so these are the logs that we would want.
This is amazing. I mean, to have that level of detailed logging is really phenomenal. I was really impressed when I used this the first few times in my lab. Well, Nate, thank you for this walkthrough on Tanium Client Management. Specifically, how do I deploy the Tanium client from Tanium to Windows, Mac, and Linux? So thank you for joining us today. Is there any parting shot or tip, last minute advice you want to give folks before we wrap?
No, the only other thing I would mention here is that back in our founding days at Tanium, actually not founding, but earlier days at Tanium, we would deploy the client by downloading a binary from our client deployment tool. In this particular case, we can do that via this button right here. So if you go back to client configurations, once you've configured a client, those binaries and the DAT file or the pub file, depending on what version of Tanium you're on, are available here. That is the last thing I want to note because that is the traditional way of getting the Tanium client out by providing that to your group policy administrator.
Man, that is a juicy little tip, and you saved it for the end. So what that means is, even if I don't plan to use Tanium Client Management to deploy my agents out, I can still actually go into the Tanium Client Management console, pick the version of the Tanium client, the OS, and then just download the binaries right there. And you said, if I heard you right, that the little DAT file material is all wrapped in there?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So it'll give you everything you need to install that client. And in fact, you can install it with a single command. You run the binary command with a -S flag for silent, and it will install just fine on you. So it's an all-in-one package.
Fantastic. And that's what we're always looking for, is the easy button. Well, thanks for joining us today on the show, Nate. And I'm going to wrap up as I usually do with a few takeaways here. First things first, you're going to think about your configurations. What settings are going in there? Am I targeting the Tanium server, the Zone server, both? Right? What credentials am I going to apply? Is this list of try this one next, try this one next, try this one, right? Set up those creds. And then a deployment is simply that configuration plus the creds plus a group of computers that you then target by the means that Nate showed us. And then again, we can deploy this Windows, Mac, and Linux. The OS doesn't really matter there. We can hit all those. And this is available on-prem. So the trick here with TAS, if you're a TAS customer, is they're over the internet. You're not going to be able to make a WMI connection to a Windows box, for example, unless you've got some special routing configured. So TAS, stay tuned on that one. And when you're planning for this on-prem, remember that your Tanium module server, whether that's TANOS or Windows, is going to need line of sight network connectivity to those endpoints you're targeting. And then finally, just watch out for those caveats of making sure you've got a securely managed credential. Obviously, we're going to encrypt that on the Tanium server a couple different ways to make sure that it's safe there, but you want to manage the credential that you're using there. Look out for the networking, look out for AV, all those usual suspects that interrupt automation at scale like this. And finally, we've got a special link for you today, bit.ly Tanium's TCM will take you to my favorite website, docs.tanium.com. Yes, and out there we have all the docs for Tanium Client Management. And finally, if you would like to discuss anything you saw on today's show with myself or Nate, then you can go to that Go-Tanium discussions, which will take you to community.tanium.com, where we would love to continue this conversation after the show. Thanks for joining us of today's episode of Go-Tanium Tech Talks, where we were deploying the client with TCM. Stay tuned. This is part one. Part two, we're going to look at some special client troubleshooting tools. And I don't think I've ever seen any client troubleshooting tools as robust as what Tanium has provided anywhere else in the industry. So stay tuned for that on the next episode coming up soon with Nate. So keep an eye out on the Tanium YouTube channel for that coming up. So until then, go Tanium.